were decisive victories and resounding defeats in the battles between Indians and whites. But ultimately, the war between the two was won through attrition. Indians tenaciously defended their territory, fighting a guerrilla war that lasted for years. They could have held out indefinitely if it hadn't been for one thing. Professional buffalo hunters destroyed the Indians' economy totally and permanently.
General Philip Sheridan, who eventually became Commander-in-Chief of the Army, noted the success of buffalo extermination. He said the buffalo hunters have done in the last 2 years and will do in the next years more to settle the vexing Indian question than the entire regular army has done in the last 30 years. They are destroying the Indians' commissary, and it is a well-known fact that an army losing its base of supplies is placed at a great disadvantage. The destruction of the buffalo was rapid and brutal. Herds which filled the plains for miles and miles in 1870 were in danger of extinction by 1883. Meriwether Lewis noted the vast herds in his journal of 1803. We passed immense herds of buffalo on our way. For about 12 miles, it appeared as one herd only, the whole plains and valley of this creek being covered with them. In 1859, Captain Reynolds observed the buffalo on his travels. Both sides of the river were crowded with buffalo. I sincerely believe that there were not less than 10,000 buffalo within a circle of 2 miles. New methods of tanning hides and encouragement from the railroads brought the sportsmen and professional hunters to the plains in the 1870s. They left behind thousands of carcasses. The bones lay so thick in some places that one writer described them as a ghoulish carpet. And a new business emerged: bones. Demand for buffalo bones grew from 1883 on. Fertilizer plants and sugar refineries needed the bones for their products and processing. Buttons, knife handles, and glue were made from the horns and hooves. And so a grisly trade in bones developed between 1883 and 1892. Although it lasted less than 10 years, the trade made millions of dollars. By that time, Indians were starving on the reservations. The buffalo had been swept from the plains. So too had the Indian.
The buffalo represented the Native Americans, particularly the Plains Indians' food supply. I have yet to come up with an appropriate term, but for lack of a better one, I would say he was what the walking department store. He provided for their shelter, their food, their clothing. Virtually every portion of the buffalo was used. And once the buffalo then began to disappear, their very economic foundation was shaken. With the buffalo gone, they had to substitute other means for even the kind of subsistence that the meat itself provided for them. The shelters that the hides provided, again, they had to find substitutes for in the form of canvas. And so the destruction and the consequent elimination of the buffalo really caused an impact upon Native American tribes in having to adapt from their traditional Plains Indian style of living to using the kinds of articles and subsistence items that were available from non-Indians. One has to look at the spiritual and philosophical significance of the buffalo and its relationship to American Indians. It represented more than a means of survival. It also had a great deal to do with their identity as Native Americans. And because of the philosophical concept of interdependence of all things of the universe, many Native American tribes considered the buffalo to be their brother. And once the buffalo was being destroyed, just since they were interrelated, the tribes could see the eventual destruction. And the Sioux, for example, Lame Deer in Seeker of Visions, has said that once the buffalo was destroyed, he could see the Indians too were beginning to vanish. And he said it's very representative today when you see the buffalo behind fences and in cages, because that is basically where the Native American is also fenced in on an island surrounded by non-Indians and virtually a prisoner in his own land. The Indians were thrust into a poverty and into near starvation that they had never known once they came to the buffalo. It was a tragic consequence. And it was often said by many government employees that a buffalo dead means one Indian dead. It was devastating. The Indian then had to adjust, but very fortunately there's that kind of flexibility built into American Indian lifestyles that provide for that adjustment. But many of them faced starvation. Many of them many of them died as a result of the kind of impact on the economy that the buffalo represented for them and its destruction.
The bison had to go. The immense herds took up land whites wanted, land they needed to sustain their growing herds of sheep and cattle. The livestock industry in Montana began before anyone knew there was gold in the gulches.
In the 1840s, a few enterprising ranchers devised a scheme to profit from the exhausted travelers on the Oregon Trail. Richard Grant and his sons Johnny and James traded one fresh animal for two trail-weary animals. They drove the scrawny beasts north into the Beaverhead Basin of southwestern Montana. There they grazed the animals and returned to the Oregon Trail in the spring. There they again traded one of their good animals for two worn-out ones. These two-for deals let Grant and his sons build up a large herd. Other cattlemen grazed their stock in the Bitterroot Valley for a season and then sold the stock in Oregon. A disastrous winter in 1852 cost Oregon settlers thousands of head of cattle. Meanwhile, Neil MacArthur and Louis Millet fattened up their cattle in the Bitterroot Valley. And so, the 1850s saw a prosperous cattle industry blossom in Montana. The 1860s weren't too bad for the cattlemen either. As miners poured into the state, the ranchers found a ready market. The market was close to the ranches, and the demand was great. Miners frequently ate beef 3 times a day. With flour at $90 a hundredweight, and eggs at $5 a dozen, and 75 cents for an onion, beef was a bargain. It wasn't until 1869 that many sheep came to compete for grazing land. At that time, John Bishop and Dick Reynolds drove some 1,500 sheep from Oregon to Bannack. It took them 80 days to travel 800 miles. 10 miles a day to the tune of blatting sheep, observed Bishop. Bishop and Reynolds wintered their sheep near a settler who owned a couple of cows. The settler threatened Bishop, saying he would scatter the sheep and kill the herder. Bishop then said, "I warned Dick and took him a 6-shooter. Dick, though a gentle-mannered man, wasn't afraid to take anybody's bluff, and nothing came of the matter." This was the beginning of the range war between the cattle and sheepmen. It never amounted to much in our part of Montana. By then, 1869, the lucrative meat markets in the mining camps were beginning to peter out. A few years later, the beef trade would be glutted. It was then that trouble with Indians began in earnest. Of course, trouble had been brewing for years. The flood of gold seekers crossed the southern border of Blackfeet territory. The settlers occupied hunting grounds of southwestern Montana. Other settlers, coming across the Minnesota-Montana road, trespassed on Indian land. Since the government never formally surveyed the Bitterroot Valley, Flathead Indians still lived there. White settlers, however, claimed the land themselves. Finally, cattle and sheep ranchers eyed the open range where the buffalo lived. General Phil Sheridan is believed to have said, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian." Many whites shared that opinion. But Sheridan also understood the reasons for Indian hostility. We took away their country and their means of support, broke up their mode of living, their habits of life, introduced disease and decay among them, And it was for this and against this that they made war. Could anyone expect less?
Tom Wessel points out that Indian reservations were the result of white concept, which originally delineated areas inhabited for whites and by whites. Later, they were thought of as areas in which Indians could be protected from white culture, and only recently are they thought of as areas in which Indians have limited sovereignty. If we keep this in mind, then the early thinking regarding Indian reservations can be seen when we look at the maps showing white settlement relative to reservation boundaries in Montana. Because permanent settlement by whites occurred in western Montana at an early date, we find that the 1855 boundaries of the Flathead Reservation changed very little through time. The boundary was, at least in part, a response to white occupants at the time of the treaty. The early boundaries of the other reservations, however, reflect a desire on the part of whites to designate regions to specific tribes and decrease tribal conflict. This attitude by whites may be, in reality, a reflection of white Americans' attitude towards land ownership and nation states, each of which, in our culture, require boundaries. The result was that the reservations east of the mountains were large, usually following natural barriers such as mountain ranges and rivers, although some point-to-point boundaries were used which must have caused the Indians a good deal of problem. As white expansion occurred, the boundaries were altered. One of the earliest was to create a corridor along the Yellowstone by moving the Crow south of the river. At the same time, the eastern reservations were altered, which resulted in a cattle corridor from the south. After 1880, the reservation shrank rapidly. The Crow were removed from the valleys of the Missouri River, freeing up the Yellowstone Valley and the Gallatin Valley for white settlement. They were moved out of the mountains to the east of the Yellowstone, which opened up that area for mining. The Blackfeet were moved north of the Missouri River, which resulted in a corridor from the North Dakota line to the Idaho line, and from the Yellowstone River to the Missouri River being opened up for the expansion of the railroad.
Many abolitionists in the East championed the cause of the Indian. Perhaps they persuaded President Grant to institute his peace policy in 1869. The new policy took control of Indian reservations away from the Army and put church groups in charge. Out west, however, settlers wanted a different policy. The Montana Post clearly reflected popular opinion when it editorialized, "It is high time the sickly sentimentalism about human treatment and conciliatory measures should be consigned to novel writers, and if the Indians continue their barbarities, wipe them out." Settlers in Montana clamored for military protection. They provoked confrontations, exaggerated problems, and occasionally fabricated incidents. The settlers wanted forts, but not just for protection. They wanted all the trade a fort in the area would bring. In fact, the superintendent of Indian Affairs for Montana was suspected of collusion with business and mining interests. In 1869, Colonel Alfred Sully repeatedly asked for more troops. Some believed he wanted more troops because he wanted more business. General Sheridan therefore ignored Sully's requests for as long as he could. Eventually, though, he had to call in Major Eugene M. Baker to lead a campaign against the hostile Piegan Blackfeet. Secretary to the Board of Indian Commissioners, Vincent Collier, called the massacre a sickening slaughter. Public outrage grew in the East and filled the halls of Congress. As a result, in 1870, Congress passed a bill that prevented Army officers from holding civilian appointments. This meant that U.S. Indian agents had to be civilians. Congress also kept Indian Affairs in the Department of the Interior, where they'd been since 1849. Until the massacre, it looked like Indian Affairs would be transferred to the War Department. After the massacre on the Marias River, most Indians of Montana returned to their reservations. 4 years later, a large band of Sioux and some Cheyenne trapped Colonel Custer and his men here in the gullies and bluffs above the Little Bighorn River. Custer disobeyed orders when he attacked the Sioux at that location. He and his troops gained the glory he so desired only in their terrible defeat. General Nelson Miles eventually reversed the Army's setback in a series of relentless battles against the Sioux and Cheyenne. Called Bearcoat by the Indians, Miles pursued scattered bands throughout the harsh winter. His tough foot soldiers succeeded where the cavalry had failed. Several confrontations with Miles and General Crook persuaded the Indians to surrender in the spring of 1877. What followed surpassed previous hardships the Cheyenne had endured. The Army sent them into Oklahoma Territory to join their southern Cheyenne cousins. Finding conditions there intolerable, a band tried to escape. The band split up, and Little Wolf led his group in a dramatic return to their homeland in Montana. They lived near Fort Keogh, where conditions were so bad that President Arthur ordered creation of the Tongue River Reservation for the Northern Cheyenne. General Miles closed another chapter in the history of Montana's Indian Wars when he helped defeat the Nez Perce in October 1877. The Indian surrender came after a 4-month retreat, which began in the Wallowa Valley of Oregon. Some Nez Perce refused to move to the reservation, and after the murders of some whites, the Army chased the rebellious Indians out of Oregon and into Idaho and Montana. Under the leadership of several men, including Chief Joseph, the Nez Perce succeeded in eluding surrender by capitalizing on the Army's mistakes. Although some wanted to fight on, Chief Joseph decided to quit. He surrendered to Miles in the Bear Paw Mountains. Despite outbreaks of violence by both Indians and whites, Native Americans posed no real threat after 1883. The buffalo was gone. The Indians had no strength. In 1883, that first winter without the buffalo was terrible. On the Blackfeet Reservation alone, 3 or 4 Indians starved to death each day. John Young, the Indian agent, consistently warned the Indian Commissioner of impending disaster. Beginning in 1881 and continuing in 82 and 83, Young begged for more supplies. In September of 1883, he resigned, saying, "The division of supplies authorized will not prevent distress and loss of life, and in all probability lead to outrage." Young had to remain at the agency through the winter as he waited for a replacement. His letters grew more impassioned. "I am entirely out of beef and killing stock cattle to keep my Indians from suffering. Received additional beef. Have now only 4 weeks' supply of flour. Must have more at once." It was a terrible time for all Indians, not just Blackfeet. The Indians had given up everything, but it still wasn't enough. They still had land, and white settlers kept pushing. They needed the land. In the 1870s, farmers and dairymen joined the crush of people in southwestern Montana. Cattlemen especially needed more open range. They looked north and east. They pushed up to the Sun River Valley, and they pushed east to the Smith River and on into the upper Musselshell Valley. One Montana cattle rancher claimed there were 3 roadblocks to the frontier cattle industry: the Indian, the buffalo, and the lack of transportation to markets. By 1883, all 3 barriers were gone, and the industry took off. Granville Stewart, a partner in the famous DHS ranch, wrote of the incredible boom. It would be impossible to make persons not present on the Montana cattle ranges realize the rapid change that took place on those ranges in 2 years. In 1880, the country was practically uninhabited. In the fall of 1883, there were 600,000 head of cattle on the range. The ranches were big. On Stewart's spread, 12,000 head of good range cattle from Idaho and Oregon. On the Fort McGinnis Range, 12 outfits. On the Cone Butte and Moccasin Range, 12 more. Investors from across the nation and around the world poured capital into the new industry. There were several reasons. An influx of immigrants to the eastern United States demanded more beef. Railroads were built. They hauled the cattle to the great packing houses of the Midwest. And land. The grass was free. It was open range. All you had to do was provide the stock. God and the hungry immigrants would do the rest. Cattle ranches moved in from Nebraska and New Hampshire, from Nevada and Texas. The Hash Knife, the Niobrara, the XIT, and the Matador Land and Cattle Company. Texans and other corporate interests came up from the south and moved into the southeast corner of the state. They brought the rangy longhorns to make a quick buck. Unlike the Montana outfits, the corporate ranchers grazed their herds 2 or 3 years, then marketed the steers. Native ranchers didn't like the outsiders or their longhorns. One commented that the Texas cattle were all horn and bushy tail. Because the Montana outfits ran cow-calf operations, they carefully bred a good beef stock. The return on their investment took longer. Speculators put pressure on the already crowded range. But because the grass was free, it was hard to tell who was responsible. Granville Stewart described the problem. The ranges were free to all, and no man could say with authority when a range was overstocked. Along with the cattlemen came the sheep ranchers and horsemen. Many ranchers stocked both cattle and sheep. In fact, sheep ranching was just as big a business as cattle. South of the Yellowstone River, 1 ranch in every 5 was a sheep ranch. And in 1886, at the peak of the stock boom, there were more sheep than cattle on the open range, over 300,000 more. Sheep ranchers organized the Montana Wool Growers Association in 1883. Paris Gibson was the association's first president. 2 years later, the cattlemen formed the Montana Stock Growers Association. Several other groups preceded it, but this was the first time eastern and western ranchers united in a single organization.
The association was powerful. That same year, the territorial legislature approved a position for a veterinary surgeon and created the Board of Stock Commissioners to supervise the stock industry. It probably seemed like it could go on forever, but the end of the boom came swift and deadly. The winter of 1886 and 1887 was a bad one. The range was overstocked.
The price for beef tumbled, so cattlemen carried over more beef into the winter. New outfits continued to arrive that fall. A drought prevented new grass from growing. On top of it all, few ranchers bothered to put up hay for the winter. So when the winter came, it was a bad one. Normally, wind blew snow off the grass, and stock could graze all winter. This year, there was a thaw, and then a freeze. The animals couldn't get through the ice to the grass. Besides, there was too little grass and too many animals. So the animals starved to death. Joseph Kinsey Howard described the scene in Great Falls. 5,000 head invaded the outskirts of the newborn city of Great Falls, bawling for food. They snatched up the saplings the proud city had just planted, gorged themselves upon garbage. And that spring, sheep rancher William Otis Pound described what he saw. Dead sheep and cattle were so thick there was scarcely any water in the territory fit to drink. While many ranchers hung on and reinvested, the winter froze out the speculators. Ranches got smaller, and hayfields got bigger.
And some turned from cattle to sheep ranching, since sheep weathered storms better. The sheep population increased steadily. By 1900, Montana was the largest wool producer in the nation. While we didn't have the infamous wars between cattle and sheepmen, Animosity occasionally flared between the two. In a single day, for instance, cattlemen clubbed 3,000 sheep to death. Known as the Bear Creek Sheep Raid of 1900, the slaughter effectively kept sheep out of Tongue River cattle ranges.
But the prime of the open range had passed. Soon the iron horse would replace the cow pony. It would dominate the landscape and diminish the vast open spaces.